a violinist named Solomon gets kidnapped and taken as a slave by a rich businessman named Ford. One day, while Solomon is working on Ford's plantation, a man named Tibeats tries to beat him, so he fights back. This angers Tibeats, and he eventually calls on his friends to help him so they can hang Solomon before anyone arrives to save him. A few years earlier, Solomon completes his performance at a party and heads home to put his children, Margaret and Alonzo, to bed. He then goes to meet his wife, Anne, who tells him that she'll have to travel out of New York to start a new job. Solomon doesn't want her to go, but she says it will only be for 3 weeks. The next day, Solomon says goodbye to his family as they leave their home in New York. Later that day, while he's walking in a park, one of his friends, Moon, calls and introduces him to 2 men, Brown and Hamilton, who are looking for a violinist to join their band in Washington.
We could give you $1 for each day's services.
Solomon looks interested, so he gives the men a moment to hear what they have to say. As he seems impressed with their offer, he agrees to go with them to work for 2 weeks in Washington. When they arrive in Washington, everything seems to be going fine, and while at a restaurant to have dinner, Brown and Hamilton pay Solomon for doing a good job so far. Solomon also enjoys himself, but after having too much to drink, his partners eventually take him to a room so he can spend the night. When Solomon wakes up, though, he sees himself inside a cell with chains on his hands and legs. This leaves him surprised, and as he tries to understand what's going on, 2 men walk in to check up on him. Solomon immediately tells them his name and mentions that he's a free man. However, the men don't believe him because he has no proof to show. As Solomon also mentions that he's from New York, one of the men claims he's from Georgia. Solomon doesn't seem to understand what's going on, but as he protests, he gets beaten mercilessly. At this point, he then realizes that Brown and Hamilton were kidnappers who drugged him so he could be sold as a slave. The next day, Solomon is taken outside, and as he meets 2 other slaves, Clemens and John, he says they need to find someone to talk to about their situation. However, Clemens says there's nothing they can do because they'll soon be transported to a slave state where they'll be put on the market. While they're talking, a woman named Eliza is brought into the yard to reunite with her kids, who have also been taken as slaves. That night, Solomon and the other slaves are moved to a ship to begin their journey to a slave state.
Get out of that wagon, come on.
Inside the ship, Solomon sees how one of the slaves is being treated, and he looks quite disgusted. Clemens then tells him that if he wants to survive, he'll have to forget his past and tell no one his name. He also says that Solomon must never tell anyone that he can read and write. Later that night, one of the slavers comes over to pick up Eliza to his room. Another slave tries to stop him, but this gets him killed. After his body gets thrown off the ship, Clemens tells Solomon that the dead guy is now better off than them.
Better off.
The next day, the ship arrives at the port, and almost immediately, Clemens' master shows up and asks for his slave to be released. After showing proof of ownership, Clemens is released to his master, and Solomon realizes that his friend already had a master before he was kidnapped again. As he tries to call Clemens to help him, his friend just walks away with his master. Much later, a man named Freeman comes over to claim the new slaves as he calls their names. Solomon is the only one who doesn't answer because Freeman calls him Platt. However, Freeman slaps Solomon and tells him that his new name will be Platt. After a while, Freeman puts the slaves up for sale, and Ford chooses to buy Eliza and Solomon. Just then, Eliza begs Ford to buy her children because she doesn't want to be separated from them. Ford seems quite reasonable, and he tells Freeman to sell the kids, but he says he can't. With this, Ford goes home with only Solomon and Eliza, who can't stop crying even as she arrives at Ford's house. The next day, Solomon, Eliza, and some other slaves meet Tibeats, who says he's Ford's chief carpenter. He also introduces them to a man named Chapin, who is the overseer of the entire plantation. Tibeats says they must refer to him as a master and that he won't allow them to disrespect him. He also gets them to clap as he sings about how they'd face serious punishment if they try to run away. Shortly after, the slaves start working on the plantation, and when they're through, Ford gathers them and preaches to them. Days later, Solomon suggests a method to Ford that can help with moving the logs of wood much better. Tibeats thinks it's a bad idea, but Ford agrees to let Solomon try out his plan. Solomon eventually does it, and as Ford looks impressed and praises him, Tibeats gets angry. After work that day, Ford gives Solomon a violin to show appreciation for doing a good job. Later that day, Solomon sees Eliza crying and tells her that she needs to stop. However, Eliza tells him to let her weep for her children, as she also accuses him of trying to win Ford over.
Do you care less about my loss than their well-being?
Solomon says he's just trying to do his best to get an opportunity to explain himself and be free. Despite this, Eliza thinks he's only wasting his time because Ford is no different from all the slavers. The next day, while Solomon is working on a wooden shed, Tibeats shows up and accuses him of doing the wrong thing. Solomon doesn't understand this, but Tibeats still instructs him to get new nails from Chapin so that he can do the work differently. Solomon agrees to this, and the next day he does as he's told. However, Tibeats complains again. As Solomon then confronts him about giving the wrong instruction, Tibeats gets angry and tells him to take off his clothes so he can be flogged. Solomon refuses to do this, but as Tibeats tries to beat him forcefully, he fights back. He also takes the whip and flogs Tibeats until Chapin comes over to separate them. As Tibeats then walks away, he says he'll be back to hurt Solomon. Following this, Chapin tells Solomon to avoid leaving the plantation because that's the only place he can be protected.
Do not leave the plantation.
Despite staying on the plantation, Tibeats and his friends eventually come over to take Solomon away to beat and hang him. Just as they're about to get him killed, Chapin shows up and tells them to back off. Tibeats protests this, but Chapin threatens to shoot if he doesn't leave. After Tibeats leaves, Chapin says he has to go and call Ford to come and free his slave. As he leaves, Solomon is left with a rope around his neck while trying to avoid falling and killing himself. Shortly after, Ford arrives to free Solomon and take him inside his house. There, he then says he'll have to transfer Solomon to a man named Epps before Tibeats tries to kill him again. Solomon begs for his freedom, saying he's a free man from New York, but Ford says he doesn't want to know about it. He also mentions that he'll be using Solomon to pay a debt he owes Epps.
You must know that I'm not a slave.
The next day, Solomon arrives at Epps's house. After a while, Epps lectures all his new slaves about how he'll flog them mercilessly if they do something he doesn't like. Following this, he directs them to go to his cotton farm to start working. After a day of work, Epps meets the slaves to determine who worked more. As he's told that a slave named Patsy worked more than everyone, Epps takes his time to praise her for always being one of his best slaves. However, after he learns that Solomon and some other slaves didn't do well, he instructs them to be flogged. Later that day, while Patsy is making dolls with some stalks, Epps's wife, Mistress Epps, sees this and looks angry because she doesn't like how her husband praises the slave. That night, Epps calls his slaves to dance for him while Solomon plays his violin. As they're dancing, Mistress Epps suddenly gets angry to see Patsy, so she throws a bottle at her. Everyone looks shocked, but she then tells her husband that she wants Patsy to be sold. Epps says he can't do that because she's one of his best workers, but his wife insists as she threatens to leave him. However, Epps maintains his stand and says he won't sell Patsy. The next day, Mistress Epps tells Solomon to help her get some materials from a nearby shop. Before he leaves, she asks if he ever learned how to read or write, but Solomon says he never got to learn well with his old masters. Mistress Epps then tells him that all he came for was to work, and that if he does anything else, he'll get flogged. A while later, Solomon leaves the house and thinks about running away, but as he bumps into a man who is about to kill his slaves, he changes his mind.
Where you going, boy?
He then gets all the materials Mistress Epps wants, which includes a piece of paper. The next day, Epps sends Solomon to get Patsy from the house of a man named Shaw. When Solomon arrives, he sees Patsy sitting at a table with Shaw's wife, Mistress Shaw. Solomon states why he came, but Mistress Shaw tells him to sit with them for tea. After he then sits, Mistress Shaw asks Solomon if Epps often talks about her, and he says his master only talks about how Shaw is a lost man who married a slave. As Mistress Shaw looks uncomfortable about this, Solomon says he didn't mean to cause any harm. However, Mistress Shaw says she's not bothered because it has been a long time since she was a slave. She then advises Patsy to do whatever her boss wants because it could lead to a good ending for her. Later that day, when Solomon arrives home with Patsy, he tells her to head to her room immediately while he handles Epps, who looks angry. Epps then asks what Solomon told Patsy, but he denies saying anything. Epps doesn't believe this, but as he chases Solomon, he eventually falls. When he then gets Solomon to lift him back up, Epps finally gets the chance to punish the slave, but as his wife shows up, he leaves him because he doesn't want her to complain about Patsy.
I tried to explain, but it's led to all this.
What is it?
That night, Solomon sees Epps taking Patsy out of the room, but he can't say anything. The next day, Solomon continues to run errands for Mistress Epps, but he also gets some paper for himself and hides it in a tree. When he returns home that night, Patsy begs him to kill her because she's tired of how Epps keeps using her. However, Solomon refuses to do it. Days later, Epps's cotton farm gets affected by cotton worms, and since the slaves won't be of much use to him, he decides to loan all of them except Patsy to a judge named Turner so they can work on his farm. After the slaves arrive at Turner's plantation, he shows them around and gets his overseer to show them what to do. When the slaves start working, Turner looks quite impressed by Solomon, so he calls him after the day's work. As Solomon then meets Turner, the master commends his work and decides to reward him by putting in a word for him to play his violin at a friend's event. Solomon agrees to do this, and the next day, he gets to perform at the event. Days later, Solomon and the other slaves return to Epps's house after the cotton worm plague. Epps welcomes them back and tells Solomon that even though Turner was nice to him, he needs to realize that he's back to his original master. As the slaves then walk to their room, Solomon sees Patsy's bloody eye and realizes that Epps has beaten her even more in the absence of the other slaves. The next day, a man named Armsby joins the farm as a new worker. Later that day, Epps gets an update on how much work his slaves have done. Even though Armsby is one of the workers who worked the least, Epps doesn't allow him to get flogged because he's white. However, Solomon and some other slaves are flogged. That night, as Armsby is helping Solomon clean his wounds, he asks how a white man found himself on the farm. Armsby then says he's just there to make an honest income after he lost his old job as an overseer on a farm where he used to deal with slaves. He also mentions that one of the things that made him lose his job was that he could no longer deal with whipping slaves regularly. This makes Solomon see him as an honest man, so he begs Armsby to help him drop a letter for his friends so they can come and rescue him because he's not a slave. Armsby agrees to help, so Solomon starts writing the letter with an improvised ink. However, later that day, Epps sees him and accuses him of trying to send a letter to his friends through Armsby. Solomon immediately denies it, saying Armsby is lying because he wants to become the overseer on Epps's farm. He also tells Epps that there's no way he would have written a letter because he doesn't have access to paper and ink. Luckily, Epps believes him, and he says he'll get Armsby kicked out. A while later, Solomon burns his letter as he realizes that Armsby was not honest with him. The next day, a slave named Abrams dies on the farm, and Solomon helps in burying him. He also sings with the others as they pay their respects to Abrams.
My soul arise in heaven, Lord.
The following day, a man named Bass starts working on the farm. Because he's white, Epps tries to get Bass to drink with him, but the man rejects the offer. Epps then notices that Bass seems to have something on his mind, so he tells him to say it. As he does, Bass says that he can't believe how badly Epps treats his workers. Epps says they're his slaves, but Bass says that slavery is just an act of injustice to people. He also tells Epps that all the slavers will one day get what they deserve for their actions. Epps doesn't like this, and he tells Bass exactly how he feels.
A fearful ill resting upon this nation.
Later that day, Epps realizes that Patsy is missing, and this gets him angry. When she returns, Epps tries to beat her, but she says she went to get soap from Mistress Shaw because Mistress Epps no longer gives her soap to take her bath. Solomon also pleads for her, but Epps doesn't believe Patsy. As he gets her ready to be flogged, he tells Solomon to do it. Solomon hesitates, but Patsy says she'd rather it be him. As he then flogs her, he doesn't do it quite well, and Mistress Epps tells her husband that he needs to do it by himself.
He pantomimes.
When Solomon refuses to flog Patsy harder, Epps takes the whip and flogs him. As his wife then continues instigating that he beats Patsy harder, Epps does just this. After a while, Solomon looks really sad as he watches the other slaves cleaning Patsy's wounds as she's in pain. The next day, while at work, Solomon asks where Bass came from, and he says he's from Canada. Solomon then says he has been there before, but Bass is surprised that a slave has traveled that far. Following this, Solomon says there are a lot of things Bass doesn't understand. As Bass then promises to keep his secret, Solomon narrates his story. Bass feels really sorry for him, and Solomon takes this opportunity to beg him to send a letter to his friends so they can help him. Even though Bass initially says he's scared of doing it, he eventually agrees because it could change Solomon's fortunes.
I will write your letter, sir.
Days later, while Solomon is working, some men arrive at Epps's house. As Solomon wonders what's happening, one of the men approaches him to ask if he knows another man near the car. Solomon immediately recognizes him as a friend named Patrick. The man then asks what his name is, and he says he's Solomon. He also mentions that he has a wife and 2 kids. As he starts to head toward Patrick, Epps shows up and says he can't go anywhere because he's a slave. However, Solomon just runs to hug Patrick, who tells Epps that he has been holding a free man as his slave. As Epps keeps repeating that Solomon is his slave, Patrick says he can challenge the case in court if he's not pleased. Before Solomon finally leaves, Patsy calls him from behind. He then goes to hug her, after which he feels sorry for her as he leaves with Patrick and the other men. Days later, Solomon looks quite hesitant as he's about to go into his house to meet his family. He eventually gets encouraged to enter, and as he does, he sees that his wife and children are now older. As Margaret then welcomes him back, she also shows him her husband and new baby, whose name is also Solomon. This gets Solomon emotional, and as Anne hugs him, he says sorry for leaving her. However, she tells him that he's not at fault for anything that happened. As he then cries, his family hugs him and looks relieved to have him back.